Jai Baba. Hello and welcome everyone to the Meher Spiritual Center's virtual presentation on the historical life of Baba. We're live streaming from the Meher Center here in Myrtle Beach, and this is in continuation of Jamie Newell's 10-part series, and we are on talk number 9. As a part of the center's initiative to share Baba's life and message and to spread his message of love and truth, we, starting this year, have done quite a few different experimentations with virtual programs, with this being something that we are recording and also putting on social media and on our website. So we welcome you to join us every third Sunday of the month to be here to see this live or to tune in for the recording. And today I'd like to bring Jamie on to share with us what the talk will be about. So Jamie, come on in. So what is today's
Thank
talk
you.
about?
This is, as you said, talk 9. It's essentially it's called just the later years from 1959 to 1969.
Great. Thank you so much. So I'll just turn it on over to you.
All right, I'll share my screen. So, welcome to Meher Baba of Ahmednagar, His Life in Historical Perspective. This is talk 9, the later years from 1959 to 1969. And this is what we would say the penultimate talk, meaning the next to last talk. And with this installment, we're going to close the final chapter of Meher Baba's life. In the next and final installment, we'll talk about events surrounding his passing, subsequent changes in the Meher Baba community resulting from his passing, and the continued growth of a worldwide Meher Baba movement. Now, what I want to do in this talk is, in addition to discussing some of the global and cultural upheavals that were taking place in the world during this time, we're also going to focus on 3 major themes of this final period of Baba's life. And we could think of this in many different ways. I've just decided that I think these are salient points that affected everything else that was going on. So the first is his physical suffering resulting from his December 1956 automobile accident. The second is his continued distancing of himself from his followers through long periods of seclusion and what he called his seclusion work, his universal work. And that's the third point, was his stated objective during this time was on focusing on the completion of this universal spiritual work for humanity that we've talked about since the very beginning of his encounter with Babajan. He saw himself as having a mission, and he embraced that mission, and everything he did, we can see from his perspective, he was working towards the fulfillment of what he saw as his mission to do universal spiritual work for humanity. Now, there are many significant events which occurred during this period that we won't be able to explore. Of course, it's a long period. It is quite significant, although there was not as much travel as there were in the other periods. But there are a couple important events that I will cover in a little depth. One in particular is the East-West gathering, when followers from all over the world came together for what he would call darshan, but just means spending time with the master, being seen by the master. And another area which he focused on during this period, and he put special emphasis on, was the importance of discouraging young people from indulging in drugs, particularly LSD and other hallucinogens. And as we'll see, this is kind of a result of the cultural changes that were going on, and people were starting to experiment with drugs. Now, additionally, in between long periods of seclusion, there were also several times when Meher Baba did hold darshan events. As I say, darshan just means the sight of the master, seeing the master and being seen by the master. When his followers would come and have his darshan, sometimes at Meherzad, oftentimes at Guruprasad, which was the palace in Pune, which was given to him for his use during the times he was in Pune by the Maharani of Baroda. And additionally, there were gatherings at the newly constructed, in the 1960s, Pune Meher Baba Center. Now, however, the overwhelmingly dominant feature of this period, as I've said, was Meher Baba's physical suffering. His physical discomfort during this period overshadowed all other activities and often dictated when he would see others and when he would go into seclusion, and really everything kind of hinged on that. Often programs were delayed or they were canceled. The East-West Gathering is one of these. It was scheduled for different times, and then it was going to be a certain length, and it was shortened, but all based on his physical health and his discomfort that he was experiencing. So this discomfort was primarily the result of the second automobile accident, which involved his leg, which had been resting on the dashboard. His leg, when they went into the ditch where the car went during the accident, his leg, which had been on the dashboard, was jammed into his hip socket, shattering the hip and just causing untold damage that was very, very hard. It couldn't be reconstructed, and it was very painful, and it was difficult for him to walk. Many doctors were called. Many of those consulted said that he never would walk again, although eventually he did walk again after much painful physical therapy, and often with the help of this one doctor who was the few doctors who could really help him, Dr. Harry Kenmore, chiropractor, a blind chiropractor from New York, developed a close relationship with Baba, would come periodically and give him chiropractic adjustments, and made adjustments to his shoes, and the flooring in the hall at Meherazad was put in because Kenmore said it would help Baba. It was his physical therapy, walking back and forth for exercise. Two of the doctors in the Mandali, that's in Meher Baba's disciples at this period, were Dr. Goher Irani and Dr. William Donkin, but none of them and none of the other Mandali, nor any of the outside doctors, were really able to relieve much of Meher Baba's suffering during this period. Now, his physical suffering, in addition to leading to the seclusions in general, it seemed to contribute to his ongoing distancing of himself from his followers, as well as I say, contributing to the seclusion work, which he said was particularly intense at this time due to the urgency that he felt in completing what he described as his universal spiritual work for humanity. So, just to set the stage and the context of what was going on, this was a very different period from any other period in his life, any other period in the history of the world, really. The world was a very different place from what it had been nearly 30 years previously when Meher Baba had first begun his world travels. The changes were continuing to occur rapidly, both culturally and politically. It seemed as though all of the energy and industry that had been focused on the wars in Europe and the Pacific during the 1940s had now become refocused. First, during the 1950s, the focus was on reconstruction in Europe and in the alliances politically and all this. But now, during the 1960s, this refocused energy had resulted in really an economic boom throughout the Western world. And so this changed a lot of things. Now, soon after World War II, there began, in addition to that, as people were struggling to make different alliances and struggling to rebuild things, and as this boom was going on, there began a period of global geopolitical tension that came to be known as the Cold War, because there weren't bullets being fired between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but they were doing all kinds of covert things to undermine each other and try to get dominance. And it was a struggle really for ideological and economic dominance between the United States and communist Soviet Union. And this period, which started in the 40s after the war, late 40s, continued and accelerated into the 1960s. Now, the European allies of the United States, as well as the allies of the Soviet Union, were involved in these tensions as well. So people started sort of splitting off into different tribal groups, one for the free democratic societies and one for the communist societies, the closed societies. So these tensions expanded globally and eventually spread to Southeast Asia and influenced the Vietnam War, which at this time was a struggle between the communist North and the democratic South, with just advisors coming in early in the 1960s. But as this Southeast Asian conflict continued to slowly grow, the United States elected a young, charismatic Senator John F. Kennedy to be president. This influx of youthful energy into the American government seemed to bring with it a lot of cautious optimism. He was trying to pull back people from Vietnam. He didn't want to expand the war there, and he had a lot of very progressive programs going on. He had received a lot of respect for his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we'll talk about in a moment, which might have easily led to a nuclear war had it been mishandled. But all of this optimism was shattered in 1963 when Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, and that's a whole other area we won't get into. Now, in Europe, this same economic boom led to a need for more workers to handle all the business that was coming in, and this in turn led to an influx of immigrants from throughout what was now called the British Commonwealth. It had been formerly called the British Empire. It was now called the British Commonwealth, but there was a lot of social and political tensions in the United Kingdom, which continue to this day, largely because of dark-skinned people as a racist thing, and cultural and racist, where they just wanted to keep people out, and at the same time they needed to bring workers in. And as I say, this same dynamic is continuing all over the world today. Now, similarly, the economic boom, as well as the continued expansion of the Vietnam War, contributed to a growing counterculture movement in the Western world. And this movement tended to embrace a number of cultural changes in many areas, including in the worlds of music, the civil rights, in politics, and in gender relations. With the introduction of the birth control pill, ideas of sexual freedom were being explored. New drugs and old drugs were being experimented with. Long hair and anti-establishment values and iconoclastic thinking were all becoming the norm in many circles, pushing against this. It almost mirrored this Cold War, where there's a conservative side that wanted to keep things as they were, and then these, at the time we'd call them hippies, but these people, young people, coming in trying to shake things up and change things. And then adding to this atmosphere of change and unrest were protests against the Vietnam War, protests against systemic racism, and protests against entrenched traditional thinking in many different forms. This continued instability in the U.S. led to rioting in urban areas, protests on college campuses, and to the assassinations of civil rights leader Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy's younger brother, Bobby Kennedy. So it was during this period of world turmoil that Meher Baba continued to withdraw more and more into what he called his seclusion work, for his spiritual work for the upliftment of humanity, he said. So here, early in this period, in 1962, after, as I say, there were a lot of delays, this and that, eventually Meher Baba did emerge from his seclusion work for the East-West Gathering, which was held in November 1st to November 5th in 1962. And at this time, devotees from Europe, from the U.S. and India and other places around the globe gathered to be with Meher Baba, many for the very last time. It was, for people in the West in particular, very few of them were able to see him again aside from this gathering. And at this time, even long-term devotees who had been with him as early as the 1930s could sense during this gathering that Baba was being more distant, that the intimacy that they had once enjoyed with him was now changing. Something was different. He was distant, and yet he seemed to them more powerful, more resonant, a lot of people said. But at the same time, the close, friendly intimacy that they had was not the same. Now, for many Americans who attended the East-West Gathering, there was a confluence of world events that made their upcoming trip to India seem even more significant and more than a little disquieting. Diplomatic relations between the United States and the island nation of Cuba, just off the southern coast of Florida in the U.S., had become so strained that Cuba had aligned itself with the Soviet Union. And remember, there's tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So when the U.S. President, John Kennedy, was informed that the Russians were planning to establish a missile base in Cuba, he ordered a blockade of the Russian ships who were transporting these missiles to come into Cuba. And this essentially amounted to an act of war. This was is on the high seas. You don't interrupt. This is a sort of international law, is that you don't interrupt travel on the high seas. So it was an act of war, and it has been described historically now as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, this confrontation between these two nuclear superpowers, getting to why this is significant for the East-West Gathering, this confrontation between these two nuclear superpowers lasted for almost 2 full weeks, from October 16th, which coincidentally is the anniversary of Meher Baba's beginning his new life. It began on the October 16th, and it was going till the 28th of October. It kept going. No one knew what was going to happen. They were afraid there was going to be a nuclear war. And Meher Baba had previously told those coming to the East-West gathering that none should arrive in Pune prior to October 28th. So the trip from the U.S., of course, takes several days, especially in those days. And most of those leaving for the gathering did not know whether, they didn't know what the state of this, was building to a high pitch, and they did not know whether or not there was going to be a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union while they were traveling or while they were in India or what. No one in the world knew what was going on. Of course, by the time they arrived to meet Meher Baba on November 1st, it had pretty much been settled by the October 28th. But this is the tension that people were, when they were deciding, are we going to go, are we not going to go, there was a lot of anxiety going on. So that was settled before they went on. But even as this was going on the 20th of October, a third superpower, China, had invaded India. They soundly defeated the northern Indian troops. They either killed or captured 7,000 of them with a clear path into the isolated Assam region. It looked like China would be able to enter India, and there would be a long, drawn-out war. So this is going on during the East-West gathering, and during that time, a reporter asked Baba about the conflict between China and India, and he asked who Baba thought would win. And Baba replied that, quote, "As the avatar of the age, I have taken birth in India, so Bharat, or India, will eventually be Victoria," close quote. So this indeed did prove to be the case, and much sooner than might have been expected. According to one source, the Chinese had chosen the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis as the time to attack India because they expected India's allies would be so distracted by this crisis that they would fail to intervene. However, the crisis was quickly averted in Cuba, and the Prime Minister Nehru, requested help from the U.S., and they sent an aircraft carrier to the region, and as soon as China saw this response, they withdrew from India and didn't continue what was clearly a successful campaign up to that point. So this East-West gathering, as I said, would be the last time that many in the West would ever see Meher Baba. And there's a wonderful film out now by Bob Fredericks, and there are books, Bal Natu's book on Guruprasad and other sources, Lord Meher, where you can read more about the East-West gathering. It's worthy of an entire presentation. But I thought because of the global connections and everything, I wanted to at least talk about that aspect of the gathering. A promised gathering was to be held again in December of 1965, and for people in the West, that was postponed. It actually did take place, but it was only for Indians, except a few Westerners did manage to come, and I'll mention one of them in a minute. So this gathering was eventually held. The gathering for the Westerners was postponed and kept being postponed, and eventually it was held in 1969, and it's now called the Last Darshan. We'll talk about that next time. Meher Baba himself was not physically present for that gathering, but the Mandali thought because Baba had put so much effort into planning it that they should go ahead with it anyways. Now, as I say, another element of the focus of Meher Baba's attention at this time, and an element of the growing counterculture movement in the Western world, included the use of drugs for recreational and what people thought was for spiritual purposes. So from 1964 onwards, Meher Baba emphasized over and over again the importance of warning young people about LSD and other recreational drugs, particularly psychedelic drugs. It was especially problematic that many thought these drugs would help them to advance spiritually. And sort of to kick this whole thing off in October of 1964, it's actually, I think in September, Alan Cohen wrote to Kitty Davey, because he had met Darwin Shaw in Woodstock, New York. Tom Riley, one of Baba's followers, had gathered Darwin and a bunch of people for a public Baba meeting, and Darwin spoke, and Alan and Timothy Leary, who he was associated with, and a man, Barry Alpert, I think it's Barry Alpert, anyway, so he became Ram Dass, the man who was Ram Dass, all came to see Darwin talk, and Alan was so impressed with what Darwin had to say, he became interested in Meher Baba and was reading Baba's books, and so he wrote to Kitty Davey. He was a 24-year-old Harvard University student at the time, and in his letter to Kitty Davy, Alan Cohen described his experiences with drugs, and he described them as spiritual experiences, which were, in his words, quoting from his letter to Kitty, as close to God realization as my consciousness can remember. Now, I really can't judge what level the experience was at, but afterwards it sounded much the same as the soul facing the infinite, while still considering itself finite. Although the drugs are used in psychotherapeutic, educational, and downright low-level contexts, it is beginning to be clear to me that their most appropriate use is in attaining spiritual freedom, or at least helping one to see the path. One might liken it to a technique such as meditation, which can break through our ego's games and traps extremely efficiently, close quote. And there's more. He goes on and on about the celebrating the benefits of these drugs for spiritual purposes. Now, Meher Baba didn't write directly to Alan. He gave his reply to Adi K. Irani, who wrote a letter. This was typical at that time. Usually it was Erich, but often also Adi or others. Balnatu would write a lot to people in Marathi, and Adi wrote to Alan Cohen, and this is what Meher Baba replied through Adi. He says, quote, "All so-called spiritual experiences generated by taking mind-changing drugs are superficial and add enormously to one's addiction to the deceptions of illusion, which is but the shadow of reality. The experience of a semblance of freedom that these drugs may temporarily give to one is in actuality a millstone round the aspirant's neck in his efforts toward emancipation from the rounds of birth and death. It is good to know that there are drugs that alleviate human suffering. It is better to have a knowledge of a specific drug for a particular ailment, and it is best to put to use the specific drug for the benefit of a human body. But there is no drug that can promote the aspirant's progress or even alleviate the sufferings of separation from his beloved God. Love is the only propeller and the only remedy. The aspirant should love God with all his heart until he forgets himself and recognizes his beloved God in himself and others." So, what's going on? Something's happening with my mouse. So, subsequently, Alan Cohen was friends with Rick Chapman and Robert Dreyfus. They were all in a, I believe, I know Rick was at Harvard. I think Robert was also at Harvard at the same time. But they all were in touch with Meher Baba and received similar messages, and they worked in the U.S. to educate the youth of the dangers of taking drugs. They did radio shows, and they were on some TV shows, and they printed pamphlets, and they held meetings at campuses, and they did lots of work. Now, Robert Dreyfus, who had learned about Baba through Alan Cohen, had planned to attend the much-anticipated 1965 Darshan that I just mentioned in Pune. So Robert left on September 1st, 1965, and hitchhiked across Europe and Asia, and he had some really hair-raising tales to tell. Imagine he hitchhiked through Iran and Iraq and all overland to India to attend this 1965 gathering. He arrived on November 16th, only to learn upon his arrival that the Darshan had been canceled 3 days after he had left the United States. So it had been, since September it had been canceled, but he was traveling and wasn't in touch with anyone about that. Remember, these days, there were no cell phones, there was no internet, there were no emails going back and forth. You're just on your own out there in the world. So through an interesting series of events, however, once he got to Pune, Robert spoke to people and said he wanted to meet Baba, and they said, no, you can't. But he's got a lovely book, tells the story. There also, you'll find audio and video talks that he's given where he tells the story. But eventually he did receive the opportunity to meet with Meher Baba for over half an hour at Marazad. And of course, the topic of drugs came up. Robert had told us in his talks that he actually, while he was there at Marazad, he didn't, I guess, either hear or didn't understand some of Baba's messages on drugs, and he actually had some acid, some LSD with him at Marazad when he arrived to see Meher Baba. He was planning to go to the Himalayas later and take his acid. So here's some excerpts from his conversation with Meher Baba. Baba asked Robert if many young people in America were taking drugs such as LSD. Robert said yes, and Baba said, tell those that are, that if drugs could make one realize God, then God is not worthy of being God. Baba told Robert imperatively to discontinue taking drugs and to tell others not to take them. No drugs, he gestured very sternly several times. Baba amplified this by stating at length, many people in India smoke hashish and ganja. They see colors and forms and lights. It makes them elated. But this elation is only temporary. It is a false experience. It gives only experience of illusion. It heightens illusion and serves as simply another veil over reality, taking one farther away from it. Read God Speaks again and again until you feel it singing in your veins. And when Robert would give his talks, he said that Baba gestured with his back of his fingers on his arm, and he said, let it sing through your veins. And he goes on, tell those who indulge in these drugs, LSD, marijuana, and other types, that it is harmful physically, mentally, and spiritually, and that they should stop the taking of these drugs, close quote. Baba concluded by, and there's a lot, as I say, in Lord Mayhair and elsewhere in Robert's books, you'll see there's a lot of more to Baba's messages about not taking drugs. He says, you are to bring my message to those ensnared in the drug net of illusion, that they should abstain, that the drugs will bring more harm than good. I send my love to them, close quote. So, now that's just, I wanted to make sure I touched on those points, but now I want to get to these three, what I think are important features of this entire period from 1959 to 1969. And this first point is Meher Baba's suffering, the discomfort that resulted from this enormous constant pain from this shattered hip and other injuries that he received during that accident in Satara. Dr. Gohair actually, I forget where exactly he was injured, but she said she had to go immediately after the accident. There was a tear somewhere, either his tongue or his ear, I don't remember what, but she had to sit and hold Baba, and Baba said, shake me if I start to break my silence. Remember, we often forget, throughout all of this, Meher Baba remained silent. By all accounts, there's no account anywhere that he broke his silence out of pain or letting out a moan or something. And doctors are often shocked. So this doctor was actually suturing with no anesthetic whatsoever. And Gohair had Baba, with her job, Baba asked her to make sure, to squeeze him if he started to make any sound. So throughout all this period, in the midst of all these events of the East-West Gathering and the other darshan programs, and responding to issues like drug use and all the other issues presented to him by his followers, or as he called them, from his lovers, he was all through that time experiencing enormous amounts of physical discomfort, physical pain. Confronting the challenges for us, just observing the story of this man's life, confronting the challenges presented by Meher Baba's 2 automobile accidents is perhaps one of the most difficult aspects of understanding his life and his claims about himself. As we've seen, the first automobile accident occurred just outside of Prague, Oklahoma, in the United States on May 24th, 1952. And he, for the most part, although it was, again, brutal injuries, broken arms, nearly bit his tongue off. His face was swollen. It was so smashed against the dashboard. But he recovered pretty well. He was walking well in 1952 when he came to the center, and when he went to all around the world in 1956, did all the different fiery free life gatherings that we talked about. But then the second accident occurred 4 years later near Satara on December 2nd, 1956. And Meher Baba's followers at the time gave little thought to the question of why someone whom they felt to be the all-seeing, all-knowing human incarnation of God on earth, why should such a person necessarily be subjected to such brutal and painful suffering? For them, the only thing they thought about, the only thing that mattered, was that someone that they loved deeply had been grievously injured, along with several of his closest disciples. And there's a video that I did a talk about the mental suffering, the trauma that not just Meher Baba but his Mandali all experienced during this period, because it was such a difficult, painful experience for him and painful for them to be sort of helpless, sitting and watching him go through all this suffering and still, plowing ahead with what he called his universal work. So this is what was on their mind, trying to relieve his suffering, trying to help him, and trying to just soldier their way through that. So for his part, though, Meher Baba repeatedly referred to each of these two accidents as necessary and integral parts of his universal spiritual work for humanity. Remember, this is, from the beginning, he's framed everything in terms of his universal work for humanity. So although this may seem incongruous to someone unfamiliar with Meher Baba's life and work, he did repeatedly frame these events in the context of this life, of this work, and he did that throughout his life. But in other words, it didn't change. It wasn't something special with these accidents. He framed everything in that way, but with these accidents, he emphasized it over and over again. Since the mid-1950s, Meher Baba had claimed the title of Avatar. He said that his spiritual work for humanity was an integral part of his work for the Avatar, and we've talked about that. He identified himself as the Avatar to close circle of disciples as early as the 30s, and in the 20s to his Indian disciples, but it was only publicly announced in the 50s. But throughout his lifetime, Meher Baba emphasized over and over again that the suffering of the Avatar is an important aspect of the Avatar's work. In 1939, Meher Baba explained that, quote, "The Avatar has to incur upon himself the infinite burden of worries of the entire suffering world, while working in the world for the spiritual upliftment of humanity. This suffering of people, steeped in the darkness of ignorance, becomes the Avatar's suffering. This is his crucifixion. The Avatar is crucified every moment of his life on earth." Close quote. So later, again, he emphasized three different types of avataric suffering as physical, mental, and spiritual suffering. In June 1964, he said, quote, "I carry the universal burden, and I suffer physically, mentally, and spiritually. My physical suffering is seen by those around me. My mental suffering is intense, infinite. As for my spiritual suffering, it is ad infinitum. When I break my silence, it will be the end of suffering." Close quote. Meher Baba insisted that he, as the Avatar, worked, as he described it, quote, "in the world for the spiritual upliftment of humanity," close quote. On one occasion, pointing to his damaged hip after the Satara accident, he said, quote, the suffering of the whole universe is concentrated on this little spot. This is a tangible expression of the universal suffering I bear," close quote. He then followed this statement by saying, "I'm happy. It is as I wanted it." His close ones completely agreed with this interpretation of events. Immediately following the Satara accident, while Meher Baba was still covered with his own blood, one of his disciples, who was involved in the accident himself, Vishnu Dirarukakar, remarked that Baba looked radiant, like a warrior who had just achieved a great victory. Describing the experience later, Vishnu said, quote, "I stepped out and went to the front of the car to see how Baba was, and saw him reclining in the front seat, with blood on his clothes and face. Never in my life have I seen such utter radiance and luster as was on Baba's face then. He was like a king, a victorious king who had won a great battle." So although those who are devoted to Meher Baba may accept the theological narrative interpretation of these accidents as a part of Meher Baba's universal work, for those outside of the immediate orbit of Meher Baba's influence, this Satara accident was not seen as a great victory at all. It was seen rather as a great humiliation. The Satara accident seemed to many to be proof that Meher Baba was not a great spiritual master, let alone the Avatar, but simply an ordinary man making extraordinary claims about himself, an ordinary man who had now become seriously injured in yet another automobile accident. Now, according to Meher Baba's theological Yeah. According to Meher Baba's theological interpretation, however, this was the expected response. Baba had repeatedly spoken about the necessary humiliation of the avatar. In fact, several months prior to the December 2nd, 1956 accident, Baba sent out a circular regarding his expected humiliation. And there's a collection, you can get them from the the Trust website. There's a book called The Life Circulars. And in there are a list of circulars. Sometimes they called Baba the circular walla because he was always sending out circulars to his followers. And in Life Circular number 29, Baba said, quote, "As declared in the past, I am free from promises and am not bound by time and space. Though all happenings are in the realm of illusion, a great so-called tragedy is facing me and my lovers. My long-expected humiliation is near. My long-expected humiliation is near at hand. This may happen tomorrow or any day of this year, or it may happen next year. The love, courage, and faith of my lovers will be put to severe test, not by me, but by divine law. Those who hold fast to me at the zenith of this crisis will transcend illusion and abide in reality. I want my lovers to rest assured that my humiliation and tragedy, though necessary, are but passing phases which are bound to have a glorious end as is destined. My love to all," close quote. So later, several months after the accident, in May of 1957, Meher Baba said, quote, "Only the avatar, whenever he lives amidst mankind, has to undergo humiliation. I have been made to take this human form by the five perfect masters of this age, to bear the cross and to undergo humiliation." So, however one may interpret the automobile accidents and the resulting injuries, all of the historical records and the oral accounts from Meher Baba's Mandali emphasize that Meher Baba's physical condition was quite poor and his physical suffering quite real throughout this period, from December 2nd, 1956 until the end of his life. It really never ceased, except there were periods when it was worse, periods when it was better. But in addition to his injuries, a variety of sometimes unexplainable maladies pestered him throughout the remaining years of his life. As Meher Baba himself said in March 1963, quote, "Although I have infinite knowledge, infinite power, and infinite bliss at my disposal as the God-man, I do not use my infinite power and bliss for my avataric work. Otherwise, how could I experience the helplessness of the whole world? I suffer infinitely for humanity to relieve them of suffering, for it is for their sake that I specially come as avatar. I suffer tremendously physically. This is why my body was completely shattered in 2 automobile accidents. My mental suffering, too, is infinite, as I suffer for all the hypocrisy in the world, for all hypocritical saints. Lastly, I suffer infinitely spiritually, because even though I myself am completely free, I experience myself as bound in all men in ignorance." Close quote. So, whether or not we subscribe to Meher Baba's own interpretation of his physical and mental suffering, as I say, the historical record is clear that he did indeed endure a host of unusual maladies and often unexplained symptoms. And we could list those, but that would, again, a lot of them are, most of them are listed periodically throughout these last volumes of Lord Meher. Now, interestingly, I think recent scientific research into the effects of chronic and unrelenting pain on human physiology suggests that some of Meher Baba's unexplained medical problems might have resulted from the stress of constant chronic pain. One medical expert, an expert on the effects of trauma and stress on the human body, Dr. Robert Scare, reports that the stress of constant pain can rewire the brain and central nervous system in ways that affect the immune system and can result in difficult to diagnose medical complaints. They used to call that psychosomatic. Now people like Dr. Scare call it neurosomatic, because there are things that happen driven by the neurophysiology in the actual central nervous system. It's not something that came through someone's cognitive wrong thinking. It's actually wired into the nervous system when someone experiences chronic stress of any kind. And in this case, we're talking about chronic pain. So according to Dr. Scare, quote, alteration of the immune system has been one of the more thoroughly studied examples of the health effects of inordinate stress, close quote. Now, Dr. Scare also happens to specialize in traumatic responses in the survivors of automobile accidents. This is his primary area of study. As he says, quote, exposure to stress, trauma, and the process of traumatization has profound effects on the brain and the endocrine system. This effect soon begins to have deleterious and ultimately long-standing effects on the neuronal structure and function. So that's just to say that although we can never know if the stress of chronic pain contributed to Meher Baba's ongoing health problems during the final 12 years of his life, there exists really mountains of evidence which suggest that this may have been precisely the case. So, as I said, that's the first theme, just generally underneath all the other events that were going on from 1959 to 1969 was this ongoing suffering of Meher Baba. But the second theme that I wanted to focus on is Meher Baba's incremental withdrawal from very close personal connections that he had developed with so many followers. You remember in the early modules of this series, we talked about how his primary technique or just really his primary impulse when meeting people was to develop an affectionate bond with them. There's countless people, even today, living, I've met many of them who just have a really deep, affectionate, personal relationship and were really devastated the more they didn't know what to do when he dropped the body, because even though he'd already distanced himself a lot, they still depended on him for just everything. They wouldn't take a job, they wouldn't decide what area of study for the children to take, or the kids would write to them. And I know many, many people, adults today, who are in the career path that they are because Meher Baba himself said, oh, you should study this, you should study that, you should do this, you should do that. Everybody just depended on him for all these little minutiae in their lives. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of people, if not thousands. And so this, little by little, he was breaking these, not breaking, but distancing himself, saying, no, I'm not going to answer all your problems this time. You can see me, but don't ask me any questions. That this was the little bit by little bit, incrementally, he kept doing that. Now we left off in talk number 8 with Meher Baba's universal message, which was read out and distributed for the first time soon after his return from his final trip to the West, where he visited the Meher Spiritual Center in Myrtle Beach and Avatar's abode in Australia. Neither of these trips were public. Both restricted attendance to those who considered themselves to be lovers or followers of his. And so this was before this last trip was 58, so it's before this period, but it was, again, beginning. And even earlier than this, he'd begun these types of restrictions. They really began in 1954 after he released what he called his final declaration and then his clarification of the final declaration. Now this, again, is another one of these things that could easily take 1 or 2 or maybe even a series of talks just to discuss his final declaration, why, what did he say in it, what did it mean, what did his clarification mean. I haven't even touched that because it's more kind of in the philosophical realm. It's an important period, but suffice to say that it alarmed people, and in response to the alarm of some of his followers to these public statements, they involved saying that he was going to drop his body. Yeah, he was kind of telling people ahead of time that he was going to drop his body, preparing them for this separation that was ultimately going to happen. But he put out this following statement for people who were alarmed about this. He said, quote, "There is no reason at all for any of you to worry. Baba was, Baba is, and Baba will also be eternally existent. Severance of external relations does not mean the termination of internal links. It was only for establishing the internal connection. External contacts had been maintained till now. The time has now come for being bound in the chain of internal connections. Hence, external contact is no longer necessary. It is possible to establish the internal link by obeying Baba's orders. I give you all my blessings for strengthening these internal links. In other words, he's saying, I'm giving you my blessings that you may obey me better. He goes on, I am always with you, and I am not away from you. I was, am, and will also be eternally with you, and it is for promoting this realization that I have severed external contact. So he's saying that the actual motivation for the contacts was so that people could begin to become aware of the fact that he's always present. He says this will enable all persons to realize truth by being bound to each other with internal links. So he's saying he's not only bound to us, to his followers with internal links, he's saying we also become bound to each other through eternal links. He goes on, quote, "Oh, my lovers, I love you all. It is only because of my love for my creation that I have descended on earth. Let not your hearts be torn asunder by my declarations concerning the dropping of my body. On the contrary, accept my divine will cheerfully. You can never escape from me. Even if you try to escape from me, it is not possible to get rid of me. Therefore, have courage and be brave." Close quote. So, as I say, after a lifetime of forging deeply felt affectional bonds with literally thousands of people, it would seem that Meher Baba had begun in 1954 a slow, deliberate, and determined process to prepare people for his death and the necessary separation which would be their experience at his parting. Of course, I don't know he never declared, he never said specifically what his purpose was, but it's very, anyways, that's my interpretation. My sense is that he was, whether that's correct or not, it's a fact that people had a somewhat easier time. They'd forged such a deep connection with him because he slowly pulled away before that. It made it easier for many people when he did finally drop the body, as they say in India. So one might even say that this process began in October 1949 when Meher Baba departed on his new life. And we talked about this at that time in that module. At that time, he told people that they would never see him again. Throughout the new life and afterwards, both he and his Mandali referred to their new life experiences as a kind of death. Now, this posture, this attitude of more and more incrementally distancing himself continued and was emphasized throughout the Western trip and throughout all subsequent darshan programs, including the East-West Gathering. As I say, attendees were regularly asked to expect no special attention from Baba, to neither expect nor ask for discourses, not personal interviews, nor to ask him to see anyone personally or to answer their personal problems or their personal concerns, underlining, of course, just how many individuals had come to expect just such an intimacy with him. In other words, he had to impose those rules because it had been the norm for people to just, have him deal with all the little minutiae of their family problems and issues. But after having his universal message read out on July 10th, 1958, Meher Baba gave this statement. He said, quote, "My recent trip to America and Australia will remain my last visit to the West. This was one of 2 points which I made very clear during my sahavas there. The second point is also applicable to my lovers in the East, and that is, henceforth, none should expect or seek from me any discourses, darshan, sahavas, or interviews. This is because the time for the breaking of my silence is nearer than ever before, and I must complete everything in that connection within 6 months from the 14th of July, 1958. I may also have to drop my body," close quote. Now, so that's or most of those things, those quotes, are previous to this period we're talking about, but they underline, they kind of prepare people for the kind of distancing which was intensified during the 1960s. They're all apropos of that, and that mode was continued, but really expanded, and or you could say the access to him was contracted. Although there were times when he was at Guruprasad in Pune where he would open it up and everybody could come, anybody could come. People would come from the West individually sometimes. There were specific darshan programs, as I said, for the opening of the Poona Center. But the salient characteristic of this period was this distancing, his suffering, and the seclusion work that he put a great emphasis on. So in regard to seclusion, in Lord Mayher, it says, quote, "From July 1958, Meher Baba began a series of seclusions which would last on and off until the end of his life. The current seclusion, begun on Monday, 14 July 1958, was distinct from all those previously undergone. During this total seclusion, Baba completely severed his connection with the outside world of his lovers. All incoming and outgoing correspondence was banned. In addition, Baba kept his Mirazad and Mehrabad mandali completely separated from each other. No one was to step out of the limits of his or her respective areas. Even when Adi Sr., Baba's official public secretary, was called from Ahmednagar to Mirazad, he was only to speak with Kakabaria, that's one of the mandali, and could not meet any of the other men," close quote. And again, this is before the period we're talking about, but it's set the stage because these restrictions became more and more common throughout the 1960s. So from time to time, though, there were exceptions to this seclusion rule, but more and more as time went on, Meher Baba continued to restrict access to himself and relied on regular statements about his poor health, the strain of his ongoing universal work on his health, and the imminent breaking of his silence, which all of this was inexorably leading to. So he did continue to meet with people, the Indian Center workers and the Westerners, but mainly there were some people, for example, Marvin Campen, who is a wonderful friend, lived in Tennessee, got to spend time with him when I lived in Nashville, Don Stevens, and a handful of others who Baba told them, anytime you're in India, anytime you're in the area, essentially, drop by. They could go to, just tell Baba you were coming, and they could come and see Baba for some period of time, even when there was an intense seclusion. Sometimes he'd say, no, not now, but often they got ready access to him. So it was flexible, but for the most part, there was a very clear boundary. So he did continue to meet with people, as I said, the Indian Center people, but mainly this was in order to pursue ongoing work. A lot of his meetings with Don Stevens was about editing God Speaks, editing discourses, other writing work type related things. Bill Page visited Mirazad for an extended period to work on the Avatar's Abode project, which is a retreat like the Meher Spiritual Center in Australia, and for the other outreach work. Don Stevens visited continuing publishing work, especially the 6th edition of the Discourses. There were also many darshan programs, mostly moderately sized, the exception being the East-West Gathering, and the one in 65, the opening of the Poona Center, was also good size. They ended up having another very big darshan at Guruprasad. But again, these were rarities, and they were in between long periods of seclusion where greater and greater restrictions were being enforced. Now, as we said, his whole life, Meher Baba framed all of his activities saying that it was part of his universal spiritual work for humanity. He continued to restrict his lovers and devotees from contacting him due to, he said, one of the reasons was the increasing focus on this universal work. Arish Jeswala has reported that during one of the periods, the later periods, Meher Baba would sit for hours pounding his thigh until the flesh of his thigh was as hard as a board. Baba explained to him, to Arish, that this activity of pounding his thigh was necessary for Meher Baba when doing his universal work. Baba said that it helped him to maintain his link with the gross world. Otherwise, he said, he would drop his body. In other words, he would die because of the strain of the work. So in order to keep the link, he would pound on his thigh. This was his explanation for it. Now, finally, on the evening of July 30th, 1968, Baba said, quote, "My work is done. It is completed 100% to my satisfaction. The result of this work will also be 100% and will manifest from the end of September," close quote. He also said, quote, "How I kept it going over the last stretch to its completion, I alone know. You cannot have a seed of an idea how crushing the pressure was, for it is beyond human understanding. On the final day, my body felt as though it had been through a wringer, close quote. Now, in an excerpt from the book The Beloved, Baba explained the darshan program, why the darshan program had been delayed, and he described something of the work. And he describing that the darshan program, this is for the Westerners, was delayed because of this work and because of the intensity of this work. So he says, quote, in response to persistent queries of his lovers, Baba decided to give darshan from April 10th to June 10th, 1969 in Pune. Baba told them, quote, no doubt you people and my lovers everywhere have been wondering why, when my period of intense work at seclusion has finished, why I have still not allowed my lovers to see me. The strain of that 18 months' work was tremendous. I used to sit alone in my room for some hours each day while complete silence was imposed on the Mandali, and no one of them was permitted to enter the room during those hours every day. The strain was not in the work itself, although I was working on all planes of consciousness, but in keeping my link with the gross plane. To keep this link, I had to continuously hammer my right thigh with my fist. Now, although my health is good, and I would like to fulfill immediately the longing of my lovers to come to me, many to see me for the first time, it will yet take some time for all traces of the strain to disappear and for me to be 100% fit to see them all. And so, because of this, and for practical considerations also, I have decided to give my darshan only to my lovers, but not to the general public, close quote. Later he remarked, I have been saying the time is near. It is fast approaching. It is close at hand. Today, I say, the time has come. Remember this, close quote. So in the latter half of January, Meher Baba, this is January 1969, Meher Baba's health began deteriorating more and more. His physical suffering and pain had become more evident as the days progressed, and on the morning of January 30th, in the midst of severe spasms, he said, quote, my time has come, close quote. In the early hours of Friday, January 31st, 1969, Meher Baba instructed Alaba, one of his Mandali, a Persian man. The name Alaba is a Hindu name, but it was given to him during the New Life when there was worries about Hindus and Muslim violence, so they gave him the name Alaba so they would think he was a Hindu. But Alaba, a Persian man, he asked him to retrieve a board from Mandali Hall to be kept in Baba's room. Now, on this particular board, there were 3 couplets of the poet Hafiz. It was Baba's favorite poet. And this is this board had been given to Baba by Bal Natu just on a whim. He knew Baba liked these 3 couplets and repeated them over and over and over and over again to people. So Bal had them written in Persian and in English and written out on a board by someone who did calligraphy, and Baba was very happy with this, and he kept it in Mandali Hall. So he called Alaba to bring that board, and he had Alaba speak out in Persian, befitting a fortunate slave, carry out every command of the master without any question of why and what. That's the first couplet. The second couplet, about what you hear from the master, never say it is wrong, because, my dear, the fault lies in your own incapacity to understand him. And then the third couplet, I am the slave of the master who has released me from ignorance. Whatever my master does is of the highest benefit to all concerned. After the couplets were read out in Persian, Meher Baba bowed with his hands and gestured in respect, Khuda Hafiz. Now, there's a lot to say about this. This is just a few hours before he went into very, very almost violent convulsions and passed away. And the thing is, when people in Persian say Khuda Hafiz, that's how you say goodbye. It's like Vayo Kandias. It means go with God. It's that's a loose translation. Persians will give you a variety of different ways to express it in English, but that's essentially, he's saying goodbye. And he's also saying he's giving Mani, Meher Baba's sister, said that the Mandali felt that these were Baba's 3 final orders to them. He said that we read earlier that he said that if you want to strengthen the eternal links, then you need to obey me better. And these are his three final orders to the Mandali, given in Persian. So it's emphasizing what we started this whole program with, was the idea of his Persian ethnicity. So he's emphasizing his Persian ethnicity. He's kind of making a play on words. He's actually making kind of a joke about his own death, saying goodbye, Huda Hafiz. And plus he's saying kind of, goodbye to Hafiz, but also just as a greeting, as a departing farewell, a Persian farewell. He says Huda Hafiz. So there's a lot more to say about that. That's to me, that's just a fascinating thing, that a man who's in enormous suffering is literally on his deathbed and is about to die, has the sense of responsibility to his Mandali to give them a final order. He has the sense of humor to make a little Persian joke, and he's so grounded in his own Persian ethnicity that he does it in Persian. And so it leaves us, though, with all kinds of questions. For one thing, all that universal work was about breaking his silence. As far as we can tell, that didn't happen. What did the Mandali do? What about this darshan that was supposed to happen in June? Well, all of these things, and what about the Meher Baba movement? Is there such a thing as a movement? He didn't want a church. He didn't name a successor. What's going on? Well, we still don't know, but we're going to talk about that and all those related issues in our final of 10 talks next time, which, when is that going to be? That is going to be on Sunday, December 15th at 5 p.m. on Zoom. And that will be Talk 10, Death and the Growth of a Movement, 1969 to the present. And thank you all, and thank you, Susan, and thank you, Joe Stewart, for helping with the technical stuff. And you have anything for me, Susan?
Oh, I'm so grateful. Thank you so much, Jamie, for sharing this wonderful kind of masterclass in Baba's historical life. And I do have a couple questions.
Sure.
So as you were preparing this, I know that it's not easy to do a lot of Baba's life into such a short period of time. Was there anything here in particular that you felt like you wish you had more time to cover, but was that you were not able to at this time?
Yeah, well, one thing that's missing, I mean, I mentioned over and over again how he was doing this distancing because he had these really close, affectionate bonds with people, and I neglected to go into things like the Guruprasad periods. People, particularly Pune and Bombay people, but all over India and all over the world, because people from all over the world came at different times. The intimacy, I mean, he would play games with people. There was a game of La Risk that they would do. There's all these personal things that even though he's distancing himself, he would have very deeply, closely, warm, loving. It's like they were going to see Grandpa, I mean, he's this great spiritual master. They were so intimate with him that he was, from time to time, he would remind them, don't forget I'm your master, don't forget I'm God. Because he would just open everything to them. And so that I wish I could have spent more time on that. Just any one of those stories, some of them could take a whole hour. And you hear people who were there. There's still people living. Jimmy Kahn got barrels and barrels of stories. And others who were there at Guruprasad during that time, usually as kids if they're surviving now. But and Bal Natu's book is a wonderful book for some of that. One of the great things about Bal Natu's writings, and this book I'm talking about is I think it's called Guruprasad Memories or Glimpses of Guruprasad, something like that. But it's one of the biggest ones. It was written posthumously, kind of compiled by Steve Klein and there's two women whose names escape me who worked with Bal towards the end of his life. But all of his books, he's talking about his own personal connections with Baba and how just astounded he was that Baba was so intimate with him and so kind to him and let him come anytime he wanted during the breaks. But because of that, I think, or at least partly because of that, he was very, very interested in all of the other personal stories. So he tells lots of these wonderful, warm personal stories. So that's that's something that, in trying to get the hard historical facts down, the most salient, the most really characteristic stories are, which don't get covered as well, is this just constant impulse in him to be warm and loving, to just be to be just like a grandpa. Or I mean, in the older days, he was a grandpa that sometimes he'd be like an older brother, but he just had this family member relationship with so many people that and as I say, I think this is one of the reasons that he put such an emphasis on, and this is why I'm putting an emphasis on it in this installment. He put such an emphasis on distancing himself from people because he had to. I mean, there was an act of compassion. At the time, it seemed, oh, he's being mean. But Adi Kairani is one who, I've said this before, that Baba really, in the early days in Manjali Meme, he would feed him with his own hands. He treated him like he was the most important Mandali, and he was just very set up and he did great work for Baba. But towards those last 10 years, Baba he would come to Mirzad and he'd say, what do you want? What have you got? Tell me. All right, then go away. And then he'd talk to someone in the compound, and Baba would say, is Adi still out there? Tell him to go away. And he did this over and over. And Adi said, we know Baba's ways. If he did this once or twice, it wouldn't be nothing. But consistently, he did it over and over and over again. And Adi would just go home and weep and weep and weep. But he said ultimately it was a blessing in disguise because he was so close to Baba. He was so intimately tied to him that he said he wouldn't have been able to function. And most of the other Mandali couldn't function when Baba dropped the body. And he said he was able to send out cables and do the work that had to be done because he'd already been doing his grieving for the last 10 years. So so that's something that in all of the installments that I've done, I would wish I could do more of these personal relationship stories, because those are the ones where you really say, wow, what kind of a person is this who can think in these gigantic broad theological, cosmological concepts that are kind of bowl you over when you try to fit them all in your brain at once. In God Speaks and in some of the discourses where he's talking with huge spiritual and cosmological and theological ideas, and the same guy drops all that and just, tickles some baby, or just very concerned about someone, how they slept and all these different things. And that aspect of it is hard to communicate fully.
What I really do also appreciate is that not only are you tackling the historical life of Baba and of course the people around him and what's happening on a personal level with his Mandali, his disciples, his close ones, and just his travels wherever he's going, but also that early on in this talk in particular that you've gone through what's happening in the historical context of the world, because I think that's also an invaluable part of also understanding, what fits where. So can you share and speak to what parts of kind of the world history you were including and why?
Yeah, well, for one thing, I wanted to say a lot about what was driving the counterculture things, because for two reasons. One is that Baba put such an emphasis on the drug thing, and the drugs were part and parcel of the counterculture element. But also, many of the people who came to follow Meher Baba subsequently, with things we're going to talk about next time, came from this counterculture movement. They were disillusioned with things, or they actually were on. A lot of people in this so-called counterculture movement were really interested in higher values and spiritual values. And a lot of those people came to Baba through that lens or through that method. So I wanted to emphasize that. That's why I went into the counterculture business. I find that the intensity of the East-West gathering, aside from the sort of the bare facts of people coming together, was amplified for everybody I've talked to and heard talks, who were there, emphasizes how, once they got there and they were focused on Baba, that none of that stuff mattered anymore. But leading up to it, it was just, people, Bob Dylan was writing songs about nuclear war, and everybody was thinking this is what was going to happen. and they were terrified this was going to happen. And this was an age when grammar school students were daily given drills where they were to hide under their desk as if that was going to help them if there was a nuclear holocaust. Hiding under your desk is really not going to do much when the mushroom cloud hits. But students were taught this. There's this sense of terror that these bombs were going to fall. We're probably more likely to get bombs today, but nobody's hiding under desks. Everybody's kind of relaxed, like it's never going to happen. But the point is that was in the air. This confrontation was very real, and a really real sense of, oh my God, this could really finally happen. So there's that. I wanted to get that in there, that aspect of the East-West gathering, and the sense of culturally things were very, very different. Not only because it was such an economic, people were living in the West. There was a lot of kind of lap of luxury stuff, very, very different particularly from the kind of fakiri, sadhu kind of existence that Meher Baba had in his early ministry, in his early life, and he always lived that way. But you compare that, or anybody who was in India, even in the last 30 years, you compare that to the way things were in the 60s, where people were just everything is let's have a party, let's do drugs and let's dress funny and let's stick our tongues out at conservative people and all that. So that atmosphere was just very, very different, and I think that atmosphere in some ways opened the door to very large numbers of people who came to Meher Baba subsequently. So there's that. I wanted to talk about that. So the economic boom part is part of that, and the Vietnam War, of course, was driving all that kind of thing. And again, as with everything, there's all kinds of other things I could have emphasized. I went into more detail than I did on some other ones, but as I say, because not only was it really kind of in sharp contradistinction to what Meher Baba and the Mandali were experiencing in their lives at Meherazad and Guruprasad, but it leads to what we're going to talk about next time with this new development of Meher Baba followers. But at the same time, for those of people who want to entertain the idea that Meher Baba is God and that he is doing some universal work, there's a really interesting intensity. He says he's working intensely to change things, and things in the world are actually intensely changing. So it's food for thought for people who follow Meher Baba.
Thank you so much. So Jamie, thanks again for all of your hard work and preparation. I know that you've done 9 talks thus far, and we have one more for next time. Can you share a little bit about what you'll be talking about in Talk 10, the final of the 10 sessions?
Yeah, and again, this is a whole series, could easily be done for what I'm going to cover in the next talk. But so number one, he drops the body. This is a shock to the Mandali, one more trauma for the Mandali. They're determined to follow his orders, so that is that there's going to be a darshan. So all these young people start to come, and this really sets the stage and sows the seed for the Meher Baba movement as it occurred in the 70s and 80s and 90s while the Mandali were there. People started going to India, visiting the Mandali. The Mandali thought that was the end. Baba dropped the body. We're done. We're just going to retire. And actually, I don't know where the quote is, but I know that Padri said to. I'm going to look it up and use it in this next talk. But Padri said to Baba, Baba was planning a darshan program or something, and Padri said, Baba, isn't it, it's time we closed up the shop. And Baba looked at him astonished, said, what? We haven't opened up the shop yet. So, and that really proved to be true, that the Mandali, so many of the people who follow Baba thought that when they retired, they thought they were going to get to relax, but they actually worked twice as hard when they retired because they were now doing all this Baba stuff. And the Mandali, poor things. I just really pity them because and when people first started coming, they were open. I mean, they had to finally say, okay, you can only be here from 9 to 6 p.m. So if people would show up, they'd ride their bicycles, get up early, ride their bicycles, and be there all day long with them. And Monthly, were always secluded, people. And all of a sudden, there are these idiots showing up, asking them questions, and they just felt like it was their duty. Little by little, they restricted, and they said, okay, you can only go from this time to this time, and then they had buses and stuff. But my point is that all of this started with the so-called last darshan, this Guruprasad gathering where the Monthly met a lot of these young people. So there's that. What about Baba's silence? He said all this universal work was about him bringing his silence. What about his silence? So there's that. What about a religion? What about there's no successors? What about Sufism, and are they the new religion? What about the Meher Center? Are they going to take over the world? I mean, what is the Meher Baba? Is there a movement? People always come and they ask. I mean, Billy Goodrum likes to say that someone from the Deepak Chopra place said, well, we have this practice and that practice. What's your practice? And he thought for a minute. He says, we play volleyball. That's our practices. We play volleyball. But so what are the Meher Baba practices? Philosophically, as a historian of religion, what I find particularly interesting about Baba, and in one of the earlier talks, I talked about shamanistic and priestly religious types. And for followers of Meher Baba, we have to both preserve his legacy, which is a priestly function, and have our own shamanic, our own individual revelation. He says each one has to have their own personal connection to God. This is something very new. And he said he did not want a religion. And it may have been articulated by other previous avatars, but or even other previous spiritual leaders of other types. But Meher Baba articulated it in a very unique way, and in a very I won't say urgent, but a very emphatic way. He was very emphatic about the fact that he said the Meher Spiritual Center should be around for another 700 years, and it should be in the same shape when he comes in 700 years. And at the same time, he says everybody has to have their own individual path. Everybody's individual path has to be respected, and we have to have each our own personal revelation of God, without going through an intermediary. So, so that's I think I've already given my talk, so I won't have to give the next one.
Well, we have a lot to look forward to for our last one. And again, Jamie, thank you so much for taking the time to walk us through each decade of Baba's life and put it in a historical perspective. As far as I'm aware, the Meher Center and what we're trying to do with sharing Baba's life and message, this is one of the first times that we're systematically going through from a historical perspective to kind of lay out these things. Of course, there are innumerable resources out there, but we really appreciate that you've kind of taken on the charge to help us kind of succinctly and concisely go through the different periods of Baba's life from a historical perspective that wouldn't be, quote unquote, off-putting to people that may not know that much about Meher Baba and wouldn't want to see it in such a potentially like a religious perspective. Although I know that it's hard not to be biased, both you and me, because we do, follow Meher Baba. But I think that you've made an incredibly good effort to be able to portray Baba in a historical perspective. So thank you so much for that.
You're welcome. Thank you. And it's a real privilege to be able to do it. I thank you and Buzz and the board for allowing me to do it.
Great, thank you so much. Well, everyone, thank you again for being part of the Meher Spiritual Center's virtual presentation on the Zoom call. We also know that there are many people that will be watching this on our website and on social media in the future. So again, thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time to learn about Meher Baba. And we hope to be able to bring more and more virtual programming to you in the future. So thanks again, everyone. We wish you a wonderful rest of your afternoon and much love to everyone who's out there watching us. Thank you so much. Jai Baba.
Jai Baba.
Jai Baba. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Jai Baba.